Welcome. Good morning. So, what's our title? Bringing life and work alive with imagination and creativity. Let me give you a little bit of an overview, and then I'll talk about myself a little bit, where I'm coming from. I've got a few slides, but I'm not going to burden you too much with slides. There's the overview. So, and it's great. Some people have read my book, so it'll be great to hear questions, and maybe we can take things further. But what is imagination? What is imagination? Why imagine, and what are the benefits of imagining? For a long time, maybe I'll just blur into a personal introduction as well. For a long time, I didn't think about it as a kid. I just read comic books and overdosed on Enid Blyton and went for dreamy walks with my dog. Became a teenager, maybe started to read other novels, enjoyed the movies, still read comics, but certainly through my 20s, mid to late 20s into my 30s, that story-filled sense of sort of possibility and playfulness and enchantments, the sense of sort of being in a place, being captured and impinged upon by images, which is to say the surrounding world and other people, was waning, which is to say I was becoming alienated and depressed, I guess just with adult responsibilities, and as a result of living in the mad culture that we live in these manic times. So I intuited that an imaginative life was a good one, a psychologically healthy life, a creative life, and yet I didn't know what imagination was, and I didn't know how I'd lost it or how to get it back. So that's basically what the presentation is about. And we will be, so we'll begin with what is imagination, because there's all sorts of like unhelpful assumptions about imagination that don't help. And then we'll get into waking dreams. What is a waking dream, and how waking dream practice, broadly speaking, can help you or your clients cultivate imaginative life, which is the title of the book that I wrote, and where this material is coming from. Waking dreams, traditionally used in a psychotherapeutic context, in consulting rooms, quite possibly within the sort of client's mind as they close their eyes. What I've done and developed is a critique of some of those traditional approaches to waking dreams, and then also an expansion of their application beyond the consulting room. So that's where we're heading. My background at the moment, I'm a psychotherapist and a teacher of psychotherapists, which is how I've come across this entry point into imaginative work. But it's certainly, the subtitle of the book is Imagination in Psychotherapy in Everyday Life. It's not just for therapists. There's broad applications, and that's what we're going to talk about. So I'll just keep going with the slides. Do put questions in the chat as we go along, and John's going to maybe read them out to me. And that would be nice, because I'd be quite happy to be interrupted and speak to your, not just the Q&A at the end, but speak to your questions as we progress. So here's an image, everybody. So it is an experiential emphasis, the book, and where I'm coming from. We need concepts to create a conceptual space in order to then have an enhanced experience. So let's just begin. As I'm talking, just attend to the image and notice what is happening. If we were in an art gallery, I'd probably wander off and give you a bit of time. But as we're recording, I'll just keep going and you can keep looking. So I'd like to suggest to you that the image is not just the pixels on your screen, or if we were in an art gallery, the image is not just the canvas on the wall. That's where it starts. But we take the pixels. I mean, nobody sees. I'm just going to assume nobody saw pixels, a row of pixels. I imagine we all see a room, which is a three-dimensional space, but the screen is a two-dimensional object. So imagination adds to and joins up the data from sense experience and turns it into an image being a three-dimensional place. It's not a flat two-dimensional object. A narrative with a sense of time, perhaps. You might be wondering where this room is. There might be a sense of like the breeze coming in through the window. Also, imagination tends to animate the world, which is to say, bring it alive with personhood. And I get people to talk about this painting a lot, and usually there's a number of people wondering about, there's nobody actually depicted in the painting, but we wonder about whose room it is. And everyone will be having a slightly different experience of the painting because it happens between us and the screen. The image arises as a kind of co-creation between you and the screen. So it's not entirely in your mind, if you like. It's not just a picture inside the mind, which is one of the dictionary definitions of imagination, but neither is it just entirely an object. It arises in between self and world, which makes it a very interesting liminal space, a kind of in-between space. And as we'll see, and as we go forwards, maybe that doesn't matter too much with paintings. It's nice that everyone sees a painting differently. But the wider application is that when we leave the art gallery and walk down the street and go to work, it's imagination that filters the world and lets it in to a greater or lesser extent, and also filters what we put out onto the world. And we can get caught in unhelpful fantasy imaginings of the world. And that's the ground that we can work with on different levels. So here's a couple of definitions. One from Stephen K. Levine, he's an art therapist. Imagination can be said to be the bridge between self and world, but we are always on this bridge. Philip Pullman, the novelist, he says, you won't understand anything about imagination until you realize that it's not about making things up, it's about perception. I think that's key. How we see, how we perceive, how we hear the world and interact in it is an act of imagination. So it's a broad definition which is out there in the literature, but the common sense assumption, the dictionary definition, is of a psychological interiority, a personal, subjective imagination. And obviously we will have images when we close our eyes or when we dream. but I'm interested in how they join us up to the world and influence our interaction with the world. So in a sense, everything perceived is imagined. And how we perceive is an act of imagination. So when my imagination was being lost in my 20s into my 30s, the world became a flatter place. The world became a duller place, a habitual place full of habitual expectations, possibilities much less, opportunities for creativity and story much less. So that's the background to imagination. And then waking dreams and waking dream practice is how we are going to talk about enhancing imagination, now that we understand that's a good idea. So a waking dream, there's a lovely illustration there from Philip Pullman's, one of his novels. So you're in a physical reality and you overlap with an imagined reality. That's what a waking dream is. Now, I would imagine a number of you will have experienced that spontaneously in its purest sense, if you like. Where it comes from is sleep studies in the early 1900s. There's a state called the hypnagogic state that they began to study then in the early days of psychology. So you will be lying in bed and you know that you're safely tucked up in bed. And also you're still in the dreamscape. So it's a kind of odd dual state of consciousness. So it's something reassuring about knowing that you're in bed and knowing that you're in a dream. So consciousness continues into the dreaming, whereas a sleeping dream or a daydream is a single state of consciousness in which you don't know that you're dreaming. A waking dream is a dual state of consciousness. So waking dream practice is also known as active imagination or guided imagery. So active imagination from Carl Jung. Waking dream practice is about understanding the conditions, the principles, the skills needed to create that waking dream experience and or notice it, and then to allow an extended exploration. Any questions in the chat at the moment, John?
No, we haven't got anything
Okay.
at this time. I was just wondering if you wanted to say, I mean, I'm very intrigued by the dual consciousness notion and that distinction, and the difference between daydreaming and night dreaming. Like, could you just say a bit more about that quality of dual consciousness, maybe?
Yeah, well, I think like memories is another good example. Because you're in the moment, the physical world, and a memory is an imagined past that overlaps with the physical present. And right now we are in a waking dream, because that's what a Zoom call is. The screen is a physical reality, and it's imagination that creates the story that allows you to understand the presentation. And probably you've created a story about me and what makes me tick and where we're going to go with this. Maybe you've got a story about how you might work with this. That's an image that's happening alongside the present moment physical world. So it's always happening, and then you can sort of, so it's kind of like, like everyone likes a Venn diagram. So it's like you've got like two circles that overlap. So it's like you've got the imagined world and then the physical world, and where they intersect, that's the waking dream. And I like to talk about how that can go wrong in two ways. You can lose the overlap in two ways. You can drift off into a complete fantasy world, which is disconnected from the physical world. So it's like a disembodied imagining. And often that's what people think imagination is. That's the sort of narrow definition. It's a fantasy. It's separate from sensory experience. And then the other way it can go wrong is that, as happened to Charles Darwin, I write about him in my book. So at the end of his life, he went back to Shakespeare and the poetry that he used to enjoy as a younger man. And he was just left with the page. He wasn't able to get into the story world of the play. And he saw that as a moral failing. So like you're just left, it's like, because that's what you want when you read a novel, right? You want to get into the story, but the frustration is it's not happening. Or like you're just very self-conscious of the cinema and you're not really getting into the movie. So that is, you've lost the imaginal reality and you're just kind of stuck with the sort of physical world. And so the dual state of consciousness is bringing them together. So we're linking up the imaginal with the physical. Of course, Darwin was still continuing to imagine the world, but in a single sense, without possibilities of other imaginings. Does that speak to your question, John?
Yeah, thank you. It took it off. You sparked all sorts of it. I was just thinking about walking out, because I've lived in the same place for nearly 30 years. My kids have grown up here. And I have sometimes when I'm just walking down the street, I have this very strong sense of where my kids were. And I can almost physically see them. And I'm so when you've brought memory into that, and that present memory being relived in a physical place, I was like, yes, that sort of really, and the poetry as well. And I just remember, I remember loving poetry in my late teens and losing it in my 20s and 30s, and then rediscovering it in my 40s. And it was just like waking. It was waking up, but it was waking up into a waking dream. It was lovely.
Exactly that. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is, the structure of the presentation forwards is, I'm going to take you through the three developments that I've researched and written into the book. Developments of waking dream practice. So there's a sort of traditional or conventional approach, and there's three key developments that are bespoke, if you like, to how I'm approaching this work, and it's a critical development of those traditional approaches, and also a synthesis with contemporary paradigms from ecology, from complexity theory, from fractal geometry. So hopefully that doesn't sound too abstract. We'll try and keep it grounded as we go forward. So the first one is that the waking dream practice emphasizes a new method focused on how to be imaginative. Very often, image work traditionally was about getting an image. So there would be an interest in waking dream practice, but how that happened wasn't really studied. It was kind of taken for granted. And then the image outcome would then be reflected upon in relationship to a meaning elsewhere. So in other words, it would be interpreted. So trying to figure out what the image means. So imageries become representations, symbols for a meaning elsewhere. What I'm exploring and sharing with you today is a way of working with images as images, how to step into a process of imagining and participate in that. So the skills to allow that to happen. And the premise is that that experiential participation in an imaginative process is healing and transformative. The example I give is, you know, you're feeling a bit depressed, you go to a matinee, you watch the movie, and you come out of the cinema a little bit less depressed than when you went in. It might be because you've had a rest and a break from all the things that are stressing you out, but it might be also that you've participated in the language of images. You've been moved and joined up in a new way by the story and your participation in the story. So the slide there, so you can look at the painting as we were doing, and you can read the blurb about the painting. And I like to distinguish between imagining and thinking. So imagining within and thinking about. So often in art galleries, and I've done this a lot myself, you look at the painting for maybe 30 seconds and you think, yeah, and then you read the blurb to try and find out what it means. And you do learn things about the artist's technique, their history, their influences, their subject matter. But these are ideas. And images include ideas, but they're more than just ideas. And it takes time to enter into a process of imagining. And it won't happen in 30 seconds usually. And thinking about kind of takes us out of the process. So it's kind of like you're in the dreamscape, journeying along with the other characters there. That's what we're about. That's a waking dream experience. As opposed to when you wake up in the morning from a sleeping dream, you're no longer in the dream. You're kind of looking back on it from outside the process, from afar, trying to figure it out. And as we'll see, that feeds into being part of a process of change from the inside, which I'd argue there's no other way to do it, because you can't really get outside the process of imagining. You are always imagining. There is no complete objectivity. That must be stimulating questions. So here's the a little example of the methods that I develop in the book. So we won't do it, but you could try this. I'll just take you through. So the first thing to do, so say you're walking the dog and you're in this familiar place, and then you have a memory that comes to mind. That's what I would call an eyes wide open waking dream. So what could you do to linger in that memory and allow it to influence you and impinge upon you? Because there's something intriguing or satisfying about it. The first thing to do would be to pay attention to the remembered, recollected sights and sounds, perhaps the smells within the memory, the quality of the light, the temperature in that place at that time. So the sounds of laughter, the quality of the sunlight, whatever it was. We have to pay attention. So it's an embodied imagining. There's a whole chapter in the book on embodied imagination. It begins with sensory experience. So images are not just visual images. We also have auditory images and images connected to all the senses. And it's the bringing together of them that weaves a waking dream. Once we do that, we then attend to the feeling and thinking responses that we have to this image scape. And they will be evoked by being there. And I talk about imaginal thinking as opposed to analytical thinking. So it's kind of like an imaginal thought would be one from inside the process. So Goldilocks and the Three Bears, she would be thinking, if that's your waking dream and you're Goldilocks, you would be thinking, who is sleeping in the bed? An analytical thought would be, what part of me does the bear represent? So that you see the difference, that would take you out of the dreamscape. Now you've got a whole sort of abstract lens that you're looking through, a layer of sort of jargon, that the idea that the image represents a part of you, or as a sub-personality or as an archetype, that distances you from the immediacy of the dreamscape. Makes it a lot safer because it's not really a bear, it's now part of you. So we try and suspend that analytical thinking and attend to the feeling, the direct feeling and thinking responses within the dreamscape. And then in the third step, we just kind of bring that together, we weave that together, and that establishes, with the sensations, that establishes what's called the hypnagogic state. So you've got a fairly firm sense of being in the image, and also you know that you're walking the dog or you're sitting in a consulting room. So far, so good. And then the exploring steps. Often there's a standout image within the dreamscape, something figural that catches your attention. That creates a dramatic tension, and it's the dramatic tension that moves the story forwards. So by finding out and looking for the novel image, possibilities then come to mind. I want to move away from the dragon. I want to placate the dragon, for example. And then the activity step is we then move away from the dragon. And whenever we take an action, we then repeat the entering steps. It's all nice and slow, and that helps us to maintain this sense of being in an image environment. It's all very slow. It's all very sensuous. What we're trying to do is avoid a sense of it being made up or forced or imaginary, which is often what goes wrong in this kind of work.
Just thinking, Alan is just going to sort of give you a sort of, and again, to explain to people who've just joined in, while we're recording, do put questions into the chat, but we'll be into a less structured questioning process once we finish the recording, so that we don't have various things. What's really stood out for me, what you've just been saying there, you used the word slow and sensuous, and I'd written down the word spaciousness to describe this. And I was thinking, for those of us who spend a lot of time working in organizational settings, slowing things down, leaving things spacious, staying with the immediacy of an experience, it's very countercultural. When you've tried to bring this into a world that's less attuned to being slow and sensuous, I mean, how do you invite people into it?
By showing an interest in the experience, by valuing the experience, by directing people towards it. I mean, already I've set up a paradigm as to why that might be important. So you have to sort of maybe create a context. Otherwise people will be like, why are we doing this? So create a context, and then through understanding how to facilitate a more experiential approach, getting people interested in how they, not just how they feel in, let's say, an organization, but how they think about it, what they expect from it, possibilities that they might have, what stands out for them. Because I imagine that's what you're doing when you're troubleshooting. A novel image is a problem, in a sense. A novel image is what brings people into therapy, or what brings people into asking for help. Something has changed. The habitual story has kind of been interrupted, or isn't working as sweetly as it was before. So we can pan out and see this in a more macro sense, that the story of a family changes when someone leaves for university, let's say. The story of a business changes when, I don't know, lockdown happens. So there's an interruption to the story fabric. So we want to find out what is the habitual story that's no longer working that we'd like to get back to. What is it that has been interrupted in that? And how is it around that interruption? That's the experiential thing, because then that's what leads to the mania, because we're so busy rushing in to try and solve problems. We don't look around and consider the possibilities that it might emerge. And I mean, the whole context, as we'll see in a few slides, is like trusting that something is trying to emerge. And that if we can bring together more and more of the parts, if you like, that will happen. There's a few ideas. Not easy, because you are, yeah, it's countercultural, I understand.
I just got one comment in on the chat here, which is that sometimes focusing on tiny moments and experiences can really open up a new conversation. I find that in music teaching can be richer, even if I am sometimes feeling it's not covering a lot.
Yeah, because the complexity theory paradigm allows us to understand that sometimes it's the small things that precipitate large changes. A butterfly flapping its wings in the jungle creates a tornado in Texas. So we're definitely heading towards that. That fits into this paradigm really nicely. So thank you for that comment. I mean, music, just on that, is an auditory image that takes us into a waking dream. Same way a walk with the dog can evoke a memory or a future possibility, so too with music. Now, this segues from the recent discussion. The second development in my approach to waking dreams is an expanded application. Traditionally, they were about an eyes closed study of personal images in the mind. But if we have this broad understanding of imagination as woven into perception and as the bridge that joins us up to the world, then the skills, the quality of imaginal sensibility that we cultivate, perhaps in that more traditional eyes closed practice, we then want to carry that over into what I call eyes wide open waking dreams, which is like what's happening now. So it's like we are living in a story. We are a character in that story. And we are participating in the images of everyday life that constitute that story. Waking dream practice allows us to become conscious, to begin to notice that activity and to begin to open up and enhance and refine how that's happening. So here's a list of applications. So traditionally, you've got your psychotherapy background, where this all came from. Any kind of one-to-one work with a client, waking dreams can be applied. Because here's the thing, and this is like where the magic happens. In eyes closed waking dreams, the imagery that appears in how I do this, because I'm working with the spontaneous imagery of the psyche. I'm not using scripts. I'm not suggesting where the waking dream happens or what happens. It all comes from the person themselves. Because you're working with the spontaneously generated imagery, it's psychologically relevant to the person. And also it will be reflective of the activity of images in their everyday life. So if you have a waking dream with a dragon in it, an eyes closed waking dream, obviously you won't see a dragon hiding behind the garden fence when you open your eyes, but there will be a dragon in your everyday life. And the relationship to the dragon and the waking dream, the nexus of feelings and thoughts and activities that happened, that's like a template, an imaginal parallel, if you like, to probably how you're going about your everyday life. So art therapy can draw upon this, and indeed I draw upon some of the roots of art therapy in this work. Ecotherapy is a big inspiration for me. So like, not just thinking of the psyche as inside you, but turning it inside out and looking at our relationship to place and the land and our sense of belonging and the culture and the community. Any kind of creative project can draw upon waking dream principles, and also engagement or appreciation of creative projects can be enhanced through waking dream practice. And as we've suggested, any kind of leadership or organizational change setting, if you think about the organization as a complex system, imagination is a complex system, as we shall see. And that provides a way in. The idea that the images inside you are reflective of a wider story. I use fractal, the idea of a fractal of imagination. So fractals are any shape made of parts similar to the whole in some way. So so Russian dolls, the big Russian doll has the same shape and the same pattern and colors as the successively smaller Russian dolls within it. And fractals, although they were discovered on kind of like big clunky computers in the 70s and through maths, quite quickly they came to realize that actually this is there in nature, and you can see it all the time around you in plants, in onions, broccoli, snail shells, snowflakes, the lungs, the nervous system, etc., etc. They all have this repeating pattern. You see the same shape in the whole as you do in the smaller part that you select. So understanding the imagination as fractal, boom. It means that any small piece of like story work or waking dream work. So if you're in a big organization and you're just working with a few people, how they story that organization, because they're in the organization and a part of the organization, their story won't just be a personal story. It will be, to some extent, a fractal repetition of a wider story. And that, because you get lots of data, just as a psychotherapist working with one person, you get so much data, person's history, their current life, their fears of the future, their presenting issue. Very often the hardest place to make change is with the presenting issue. Because that's where most is at stake, and there's a lot of fear around making changes in the presenting issue. Maybe it's a worry about, I don't know, productivity is coming down, we need to get it up. So we're really focused on that. Or there's a relationship issue dynamic, so we need to fix that relationship. But because imagination is fractal, the same tensions and difficulties in the productivity issue or the relationship issue will be evident in other areas, on other scales of inquiry, and often that provides a safety to begin to explore a change process that isn't there if we just go straight into the main thing. So it's a lot of fun to begin to see the fractal that is operating. So I talk about a fractal template, and I talk about jumps to repetitions of the fractal. And then you want to refine the fractal over a period of time. The fractal will be refined as you gather more information, as more consciousness comes into the story, and then that refinement leads to more refinement, and then ultimately you get to see the fractal as it's happening in the moment. That's the ultimate refinement, and that's the really exciting possibility of emergent change. When you're in the moment, you see that you're doing this crazy thing again, and it's not the whole truth, and there's another way to go, and then you risk a change. So the third, so moving on now. So the third, nearly at the end. So the third development is the root metaphors for this work have traditionally been mechanical, and that comes from Freud. You know, he was a genius, a literary genius for sure. Lots of wonderful metaphors. He started off with a lot of ecological metaphors, but he moved to a mechanical paradigm. So the main technology of his day was the steam engine and thermodynamic technology. And you might have heard of psychodynamics. So psychodynamics is an as-if mapping of thermodynamic paradigm onto the psyche. So we have like inside the cover of the steam engine, we have like the pressure and the steam. So to inside the psyche, we have a container, the unconscious, where objects, pistons, parts are putting pressure on each other, crashing around. And the idea is to relieve the pressure, to allow the unconscious material to come into consciousness. The thing that, I mean, one of the things, if you want to be creative, one of the things, the problem with that is there's a number of problems. The main one for me is that nothing new is created. It's just that you've moved something from the unconscious into the conscious mind. But from my work, it seems to me that I am engaged in the creation of something new. And so a psychodynamic theory of kind of just, it's a kind of zero-sum game where nothing is actually changed. It's just you move it into consciousness. Doesn't help me to understand how a creative process happens. Whereas if we switch to an ecological paradigm, and particularly complexity theory, which draws upon an ecological paradigm, that does point towards not just stage development or moving things around, but the conditions that are needed to allow change to happen. So a waking dream is an ecosystem, if you like. So we're networking, a synthesis of all the elements. We're working with the whole. Traditionally, waking dreams are isolated, perhaps like the inner child character, and we work with that separately from the context within which it exists. But it seems to me, as soon as you separate something from the context in which it exists, it kind of dies, and you're not really working with it as it is, like a lion in the zoo isn't really a lion as such. You need to study a lion in the savannah, not in a cage, because it's sustained by the network of relationships around it. So too in waking dream work. And then lastly, this allows for an understanding of emergent change and the process of change being around the edge of chaos. So I won't go into that too much because it's a whole thing. But just to come back to the comment earlier on noticing small changes as significant. If we want to facilitate emergent change in waking dream practice, there's a few things that stand out. Synthesis. So bringing together all the different elements of the whole, which happens in a waking dream eyes closed style. We're bringing together the feelings, the thoughts, the senses, the action. But also in an eyes wide open sense, we're trying to bring together, we're not just focusing in on one person in the family as the problem person, or one person in the organization as the problem person. We're not blaming, we're taking a systemic perspective, and that requires that we bring together and network all the parts. So that's an antidote to a reductionistic paradigm. Secondly, we're working with unpredictability. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the solution is. There's a trust that something will emerge. So at best, you can expect the unexpected. And that goes back to the novel image. So we're looking out for irregular, kind of wonky surprises that might seem odd and insignificant, but if we can give them attention and allow them to network, who knows what could happen. And that's an antidote, I think, to a kind of mechanical malfunction paradigm. So it's the sense that there's something wrong with the system, there's something wrong with the waking dream. You know, squirrels shouldn't be running around with penises on their head or whatever. It's like it's an imaginal paradigm. So you don't want to think you're going mad if it doesn't reflect a natural world paradigm. But similarly in everyday life, again, not blame, not to think something's a problem, but to look for these strange things that don't fit in as perhaps indicators of emergent change. And then lastly, just take small steps. Don't try and change everything all at once. Move forwards gradually, because it freaks people out doing big changes. And you can test it out, like I say, off site, if you like, away from the main problem. You can begin to experiment in a safer area if you have the fractal paradigm repetition. All of which happens from within inside the process of change, which is an antidote to mechanical determinism. Because it seems to me, I mean, I'm not working with organizations myself, but I'll be interested to hear from you guys. But it is very exciting, a complexity paradigm. And obviously, like, organizational change is one of the key places where that was first embraced and developed. And yet it seems to me that there's a subtle or an implicit sense that you can step outside the system and analyze it and manipulate it somehow to create a desired outcome, which seems a bit neat to me. So for me, it's like, how can we be inside of the process of change with the people that want to change, that ask our help? Because we're involved in that too. As an antidote to sort of distancing or analytical sort of abstraction, which again is part of the culture. And I'd say we'd need to, like, sort of actively work against that. So there's your last slide. You can keep in touch with me on all sorts of different places. Read my book, come on my course, etc., etc. But yeah, there you go. I'm excited now to have a little bit of a chat. So I'll stop this share and see what happens in an